first in his family and only one in his family to leave Japan. He was only 16 years old, so he was rather adventurous. So he came, and then he went back and forth, and eventually married my mother in Japan. And in 1924, there was a law that was passed that there'd be no more immigration from Japan or from the Far East. And so he went back and got my mother and my brother, who was born there, to come to the United States in 1924. And I think I probably was conceived on the ship because I get seasick quite often. So anyway, I was born after that. And so that's essentially it. He's the only one in his family to leave Japan, to our knowledge. And quite different from my wife, Grace's. We had hordes. They have a lot of people who came. Or they populated the West Coast with. So I have very few cousins. In fact, I don't know any of them personally. Grace has about 200. So that's about the gist of it. That's how he came. He was traveling back and forth, and finally he decided to stay here, and so he brought my mother and my brother here. The pre-war environment, in some ways, rather hostile, in that there had been laws that were passed that prohibited Asian families to become citizens if they came from China or Japan, the Far East. And there were laws passed, especially in California, where those ineligible for citizenship could not own property, could not lease property. So in a sense, there was an attempt to isolate the Asian population in that sense. But the way the Japanese Americans, coped with it is that they had families where the youngsters were born here, and eventually they were old enough to be able to lease property and to own property because they were American citizens. Until that time, like my father had to rely on some friend who had some close relative who was an American citizen to lease things for him. That's how we coped with the problem. In my particular instance, I went to school in El Monte, and there was a special school for presumably to teach people how to speak English and read English. And so for a time, there was a segregated school for Japanese Americans and Mexican Americans and others who spoke other languages or supposedly spoke these languages in their homes. But that was abandoned while I was in school. But for those below my age at the time, when I moved to El Monte, and I was in the 6th grade, and my brother, who was younger, had to go to a segregated school. Although he knew no Japanese, he spoke English, but they presumed that the young people didn't know the language. And so, he protested being put into the school. But eventually there was no distinction. And as far as my relationship with my fellow students, and in the community, I think we're pretty well accepted. And we had approximately 10 to 15% of our student body was made of people of Japanese ancestry, and about the same amount with Mexican ancestry. So there was a mixture of Caucasians and Hispanics and Japanese Americans. So in many ways, we're treated pretty well. And we had a small farm, and my father would market his vegetables. He would take them to markets and distribute them that way. So it was not a really hard life, except that farming is not an easy life. And we're not wealthy, but we managed to, eat pretty well. Well, we were told by posted signs that persons of Japanese ancestry were to be rounded up. And one of the ways in which they tried to code it with euphemistic language, that persons of Japanese ancestry, whether alien or non-alien, and if you were born in the United States, you are a non-alien, but they specifically identified us as non-alien, and so that's one of the ways. Also, right after the Pacific War started, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, which I felt was not a very smart thing for them to do, attacking a huge country like in the United States with its resources. But they apparently felt that that was the only way that they can get an upper hand on things. So the hysteria that developed as a result of this bombing, people assumed that we would be sympathetic to the Japanese Imperial Army and the armed forces, which was not the case at all. And so the people of Japanese ancestry at first were classified as enemy aliens, whether they were born here or not. And it took quite a while before the government allowed the Japanese Americans to again serve in the armed forces. I'd say that we were classified, lumped together with the enemy for a time, and which was fostered by propaganda, as Grace mentioned, the first newspapers. It seems the government officials at the time kind of lost their bearing on what is fair and about what is the role of the Constitution in the lives of people. So I would say that there was just a lot of rumors fostered by the press and by the media, the radio at the time, and politicians who were afraid to do the right thing because they were afraid of being accused of being soft on the enemy. And so, in that sense, we were classified with the enemy. And even though we were American citizens, and one of the things that happened is when I left El Monte High School, I was a junior at that time. One of my close friends, who is still a close friend, was asked by a reporter, well, what did you do when these, your friends had to leave? And they said, well, they just had to sit and cry because they couldn't understand why we would be uprooted and accused of things we hadn't done. And one of my friends who visited me in what they call an assembly center, we were all herded into mostly racetracks where there was stables, and they just hurriedly asphalted the manure and everything else that was on the floor. And he came to visit me, and it was a prison-like condition, and that in order to visit me, he had to be in a room like this, but I would have to be behind the wall with bars, and he could talk to me. And it just shocked him so much that he knew I had nothing to do with the Pearl Harbor and any of the things that were happening with the Japanese government. And it affected him so much that he couldn't talk about it for about 30 years. He was so shocked to see an innocent guy, housed with searchlights and sentries and barbed wire fences, and then being in a room where he couldn't just come up and talk to me, but he would talk through, essentially as some people who are in jail have to talk to people enclosed, so that they won't be able to do any harm to someone. In that sense, the government, by the evacuation order, which is the military, this entire western region was declared a military zone. And as a military zone, the military had jurisdiction on the safety, or to say, the defense of the western coast. And the General DeWitt declared that we were a threat, and it didn't matter whether we were citizens or not. And so he ordered the evacuation of all these people, authorized by the executive order of the President, 9066. So we were all told to assemble in certain places. There were signs that were posted on telephone poles and buildings and etc., telling us where we had to go. And in my case, we had just a few weeks to dispose of our property, to put them into either safekeeping or sell them. We did that. We had a small farm, but we had 2 vehicles. We had a horse, and we had pets, and chickens, and what have you. And we've had to dispose of them. We had to sell what we could, and some friends took care of some personal things that we couldn't carry with us. We were ordered to leave and pack what we can carry, and that's all. And if you can imagine what that would mean in a household, that you had to carry things with you. And so some of the things that were of more sentimental value my mother's kimono and things like that. We had to let someone we entrusted to keep them for us. The pressures of the press and the rumor mongers saying that we were a threat to the armed forces here. Just felt that we might pose some kind of trouble here. And one of the things that happened was that in spite of all these rumors and all, that we were not to be trusted, before the war, during the war, and after the war, there wasn't a single Japanese American who was charged and convicted of any disloyal act. So the rumor mongering, they also have been the result of not only racial prejudice, but for economic reasons. The people in agriculture probably would like to see the competition of Japanese American farmers diminished. The fishermen also, that there was some economic reason as well as military, quote, military reasons. So, and with the history of anti-Asian laws and things, you can see how this all built up, and there wasn't any real communications outfit like the newspapers or radio or whatever that would stand up and say, hey, this is wrong. They have done nothing wrong. You have nothing to, you're not charging them with anything. So I would say that the government at that time did not see the fair use of the Constitution and fair use of human relations. So that's the way I would characterize it. And the people, what are they to believe? They only hear one thing, and it's all, that they're all disloyal, not to be trusted, all these things, blown up over and over and over, repeated, that with no other countermeasures. Although there are very good people who did things to help us, but they couldn't come out and say this in public, and who would publish such a thing? So there were some very good people who aided us. You couldn't come out and brag about the fact you're a Japanese American, because that would not, no one would think it is a positive thing. First of all, I thought it was very unfair, and but we knew that this was a military order, and that when we reported at the train station, there were soldiers there with guns. When we were taken to Tulare, we had no idea where we were going, but we went to the Tulare racetrack, which was then converted with some barracks, and then all the stables were, asphalted and made into little rooms for families. I thought that was very unfair, and I was very unhappy to have left in my junior year in high school. I was looking forward to my senior year. I was in a sense of leadership role with my peers in high school. So I was looking forward to that. So it was a very sad thing. It's not something that, as I look back at it, it still, kind of stings you. Well, I have 3 battle stars, and I was, let's say, fortunate to be in the battle zones, and so I was given credit for being in the battle zones of 3 different areas. But my buddies who have been in the armed forces longer than me, I give credit to them. I mean, there are people who started at the foot of the Italian peninsula and had to fight all the way up, and then went to France and then came back to Italy to fight. And I joined the 442nd in France after they had rescued the lost battalion, where they lost so many men. One company had only 8 men left when they were assembled, and I think the commander of the rescued battalion wanted to thank the men, and he saw just a few people. He said, "I asked you to bring all the men here." And he said, "Well, that's all that's left." And there were a lot of casualties, a lot of men who were killed and a lot who were injured. There were just a small group of people left. They lost more men than they rescued. So the Texas Battalion, which was rescued, I would say the Colonel Higgins from that unit mentioned a number of times when I've seen him where he talked, and he said he'd go anywhere to thank the men of the 442nd, because without them he would not be there. And there's a very emotional, beautiful letter written by the daughters of one of the men who was rescued, mentioning how they would never have known their father if it hadn't been for the 442nd. So it was one of the big battles, major battles of World War II. And so I think that's one of the reasons why the 442nd has been considered not only for that battle, but it's the most decorated unit of its size and length of service in the history of the U.S. Army. And this is a quote from an Army historian. So I would say that in terms of my involvement, I came in late, but it was still dangerous. I mean, I just learned about one fellow who was killed in the major battle I was in, and another one was killed and received a Congressional Medal of Honor, and another one who survived, and as a result of his actions in Italy in the final battle that we were sent in as a diversionary force, and turned out we became the major force in overcoming the Gothic line, which the Allies could not penetrate for months. And we were called by the General Mark Clark. He requested the 442nd to come to Italy, and we had to climb this very, very steep mountain, and because the Germans had outposts that saw the valley, and they could see every movement that the Allied soldiers would make, and we had to climb this at the middle, in the darkness, and surprise them, and when we were able to get up. One of the Congressional Medal of Honor winners as a result of that battle was Senator Daniel Inouye. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, but upon review by the White House and the Army, a lot of the Distinguished Service Cross recipients really should have received the Congressional Medal of Honor, and they were 21 of them who were given the Congressional Medal of Honor presented by President Clinton. So I would say that in terms of battles, I can say I was in one major battle, and I was part of some other things, but I wouldn't say I was a major thing for me. It just happened to be part of it. And but wherever you are during the war, it's not a safe place, especially if the enemy is trying to shell you and trying to get rid of you. So the final battle, which I was involved in, climbing this huge mountain in the middle, pitch black, night, and fortunately we had partisans from the Italians were helpful to us and knew the ground. They showed us the way up. It was dangerous, but fortunately I got in there, and thanks to my very good squad leader who told me how to not be a target, that I survived, and I had vowed that if I came out alive, I would try to be a decent human being and to help people, which I have been able to do as an educator. At first, I think there was some problem in the sense that they didn't know what our capabilities were, and so there might have been some hesitation to be associated with us. But as the members of the 442nd and the 100th Battalion won major battles and were part of major battles, and how they were so very good and courageous in the way they fought, that we became sort of wanted as the unit to penetrate the enemy forces. So as far as I know, I think we're treated pretty well, because by the time I joined, the reputation of the 442nd was pretty clear, and there's a lot of admiration for the people in the 442nd. I would say that even though it was a segregated unit, that of Japanese Americans primarily, with some Caucasian officers, and eventually many of our Japanese Americans became officers. It's as the war went on and as the reputation of the 442nd became much more known, we were admired more than resented. And in the Pacific, the Japanese Americans who were interpreters and deciphers of enemy communications, they did so much to help the U.S. in knowing what the enemy was going to do that MacArthur himself said that in no time in U.S. history did the armed forces know what the enemy is planning to do more than they did in the Pacific. So the Japanese Americans who were assigned as military intelligence personnel did so much to help the U.S. soldiers. Discrimination, and therefore, well, I think that, give you an example, the 442nd, the artillery unit was detached, and they were so very good that the Army decided that they needed them to advance into Germany. And so they were among the first to go to this Dachau, where the Holocaust was being executed. And the Army, there was no mention of the Nisei soldiers, Japanese American soldiers, being in Dachau, because there was an embarrassment that here the Japanese Americans were rescuing these prisoners, the Jewish prisoners in Dachau, when their own families were incarcerated in the United States. You see, I mean, how do you explain that to in a news release that so for many, many years there was no acknowledgement of the fact that Japanese American soldiers were actually helping the Jewish prisoners get back to having some food and clothing and all these things, and rescuing them from near starvation. In terms of medals, the very fact that so many congressional medals of honor were the result of upgrading from the Distinguished Service Cross, that it was determined then, after much study, that these men, if they were not Japanese Americans, would probably have received the Congressional Medal of Honor if they happened to be Japanese Americans. So I think there was discrimination, that it was an embarrassment to give so many medals to a group of people whose families were still incarcerated. And also there was still some hostility about the fact that, there was still a war in Japan, against Japan. So I'd say yes, there was some discrimination. But as far as my experience, I wouldn't say that I experienced any of that sort of thing. Which I got a Bronze Star, but that was presented to me after the war. Well, it's a pleasure to be interviewed by you today, and I would say that if I were to live my life over again, the circumstances would be quite different. So I can't predict what it might be, but I would say that I am pleased with myself in the sense of doing things that happened to me in the way I have done them. One of the things that Chelsea Clinton said about her grandmother is that she said, it doesn't matter what happened to you, it really matters what you do when something happens to you. So in a sense, I think I've been sort of a poster person for that sort of thing, because things did happen to me, and that I somehow managed to be smart enough to take advantage of these situations, to, instead of making it into a negative, try to make it into a positive. So I would say that this is very true for, I think, anyone, that you try to build on experiences you have, the background that you are getting from your family, your friends, your community, all these things. And sometimes these experiences may not be the most positive, but you take the things that you can build with. And so, in a sense, my being incarcerated and being thrust into a group of people who seemed in my high school classes are so darn many smart people that it made me perform a little better, and also be thrust into a situation where there was a need for some leadership, and that I was able to train myself to become interested in developing my leadership abilities, so that I was able to become an officer in the senior class, and a number of clubs, and had a lot of experiences with debates and being in front of people, working with other people. Those things, I think, helped me in becoming a teacher and becoming an educator, working with other people. It was, I think, a building process where you try not to worry too much about the things that were unpleasant, and you try to build on things that you know you can build on. So, in my case, I had some art ability, and I built on that. I had the ability to work with people, so I built on that, which made me into a teacher. And my students have taught me a lot in how to be a teacher, because they inspired me by being enthusiastic and willing to accept things. So I'd say, by and large, if you can take a positive look on things, put on your good glasses instead of bad ones, it's always easy to find mistakes, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't look for some mistakes so you can build on them, but it's better to look for things that are really good and build on those things. We know that a lot of people who have become really very famous have built on a lot of their experiences that were very positive, and they have perhaps built on things that they themselves have created that were positive. I think being optimistic about life, learning from your friends, learning from your peers, learning from others around you, others above you, and others who might not be quite up to your standard. Learn from all these people. And I think that if you work hard and have a goal of especially helping people, I think that would be good for many, many things. So I'd say that's what all I can tell you. Do the best you can, be the best person you can be, and help others be the best person they can be. And I think that is a role of a teacher and a role of a leader, and to be a good human being and to help other people achieve what they can achieve. So thank you.